Good evening, friends. It's so lovely to have you here with me tonight. Before we begin our gentle journey together, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? Perhaps it's late evening, or maybe you've already slipped beneath your covers as the day fades into darkness. Wherever you are, whatever hour has brought you here, you're welcome. Take a moment now to dim your lights, if you haven't already. Let the glow of your screen soften. Rest your head against your pillow and feel its coolness against your cheek. Pull your blanket a little higher, tucking yourself into that perfect cocoon of warmth. Allow your breathing to soften, to slow, to find its own gentle rhythm. There's nowhere else you need to be. Nothing else requires your attention. Just this quiet space, this calm voice, and a story that will drift alongside you into sleep. Tonight, we'll wander slowly through something quite unusual. We'll explore an ancient mystery wrapped in winter's cold embrace, a tale of survival, of whispered knowledge, and of beings called the Anunnaki who some believe taught humanity how to endure the harshest seasons. Whether you believe in ancient astronauts or simply enjoy the quiet comfort of old stories, there's something soothing about imagining our ancestors learning to survive, to thrive, through long winters when the world seemed determined to freeze them into stillness. And if this peaceful journey helps you unwind, if my voice becomes a companion to your dreams, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. No pressure. Just an invitation to return whenever sleep feels distant and you need a gentle story to guide you home to rest. Now let your eyes grow heavy. Let the world outside fade. And let us begin. Imagine, if you will, a time so distant that even the oldest trees would be considered young. We're drifting back approximately 6,000 years to the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where the Sumerians first learned to scratch symbols into wet clay and call it writing. But before even those earliest cuneiform tablets, before the first cities rose from the mud, there were simply people. People who knew the warmth of summer and the bounty of autumn, but who faced each winter with growing dread. The winters then weren't like the predictable seasons we experience now, marked neatly on our calendars with cheerful snowflake icons. No, these were winters that arrived like unexpected guests, staying far longer than welcome, bringing with them a cold that seeped into bones and a hunger that hollowed out bellies. Our ancestors, your ancestors, my ancestors, they didn't have heated homes or grocery stores stocked with provisions. They had mud brick shelters, animal skins for warmth, and whatever food they'd managed to preserve from the growing season. Sometimes it wasn't enough. According to ancient Sumerian texts that archaeologists pieced together from thousands of clay fragments in the late 19th century, particularly around 1876 when George Smith was translating creation myths in the British Museum, there existed beings called the Anunnaki. The name itself is hauntingly beautiful when you say it slowly. Anunnaki. These were described as gods who came from the heavens, who possessed knowledge far beyond human understanding, and who, for reasons the texts never quite make clear, decided to teach humanity certain crucial skills. Now, I find it rather comforting to imagine this scene, whether you believe it literally or see it as mythology. Picture the landscape at dusk. The sky bruises into deep purples and blues as the sun surrenders to night. Smoke rising from scattered fires where small groups huddle together, perhaps sharing the last of their dried dates. Those sweet, sticky fruits that the Mesopotamians discovered could last for months if stored properly in sealed clay jars. Dates were their candy, their comfort food, and archaeological evidence from the ancient city of Ur, excavated in 1922 by Leonard Woolley, revealed massive storehouses filled with date pits, suggesting just how central this sweet fruit was to their survival. The story goes that during one particularly brutal winter, when the wind carried ice crystals that stung exposed skin and the rivers froze at their edges, a rare occurrence in that region, but it did happen during what climatologists now call the early Holocene climate fluctuations, the people were desperate. They'd eaten through their stores of barley bread, that dense, hearty bread they'd learned to make by grinding grain between stones and baking it on hot rocks. There's something wonderfully grounding about imagining that bread, isn't there? The weight of it in your hand, the slight grit of grain against your teeth, the way it filled your stomach with a warmth that lasted. But even the barley was running out. And that's when, according to the texts inscribed on tablets now catalogued as the Enuma Elish and various cylinder seals, the Anunnaki appeared. Not with fanfare or thunder, but quietly, almost as if they'd always been there, emerging from the early morning mist that rose from the rivers. The texts describe them as tall, with eyes that reflected light strangely, wearing garments that seemed to shimmer despite the gray winter sky. Now, here's where it gets interesting, in that soft, curious way that might tickle your mind even as it drifts toward sleep. The Anunnaki, according to these accounts, didn't just give the people food. They taught them how to create food systems that could endure. They showed them how to dig storage pits deeper, below the frost line where the earth remained at a constant temperature, a principle we still use today in root cellars. They demonstrated how to ferment grains into beer, not for pleasure, though that was certainly a benefit, but because the fermentation process preserved nutrients and made contaminated water safe to drink. The earliest evidence of beer production dates to around 7000 BCE in what is now Iran, making it one of humanity's oldest crafted beverages. Imagine learning this for the first time. You're a person who's only ever eaten raw or simply cooked food. Preservation meant drying in the sun or salting if you were lucky enough to have salt, that precious white gold extracted from evaporated seawater or mineral deposits. And suddenly, someone shows you that if you mix crushed barley with water and leave it in a sealed vessel with the wild yeasts that float through the air, it transforms into something that won't spoil, that actually becomes more valuable with time, that can sustain life when fresh water turns dangerous. It must have seemed like magic. Perhaps it was in its way. The Anunnaki also taught them about fat storage. This might not sound exciting, but let me share something that I find oddly soothing. They showed the ancient peoples how to render animal fat, taking the fatty tissue from hunted game and slowly heating it until it liquefied, then storing it in sealed containers. This rendered fat, which we might call tallow or lard, was calorie-dense in a way that lean meat could never be. A single spoonful contained enough energy to sustain someone through hours of cold exposure. It could be mixed with dried fruits, like those dates we mentioned, and grains to create something remarkably similar to modern survival bars. Archaeologists have found residue in ancient pottery from around 5000 BCE that suggests exactly this kind of preparation. But there was something else, something the texts mention almost casually, as if it were too obvious to elaborate upon. The Anunnaki taught them about gathering in groups for warmth, about building fires in the center of communal spaces so that multiple families could share the heat and the fuel needed to maintain it. This seems simple, almost too simple to mention, but consider the trust it required. These weren't people with legal systems or written contracts. Survival often meant competing for resources. To voluntarily share limited firewood, to sleep in the same space as another family, to pool your food stores with others knowing you'd all starve together if the winter lasted too long, that was revolutionary. That was civilization beginning not with grand architecture but with the simple, profound act of trusting your neighbor with your life. The texts describe long nights where the Anunnaki sat with the people, teaching them to count the stars, to track the moon's phases so they could predict when spring might return. This astronomical knowledge, preserved in tablets like the Emuel.Appin catalog from around 1000 BCE but referencing observations far older, gave people something precious, hope measured in celestial cycles. When you know that the sun's position will shift, that the constellation you now see will eventually give way to others associated with warmth and growth, you can endure. You can wait. You can survive another night. There's a peculiar comfort in imagining those first lessons, isn't there? The crackle of fire, the press of bodies huddled together for warmth, the quiet voice of someone sharing knowledge that might mean the difference between seeing another spring or becoming another winter casualty. Whether the Anunnaki were literal beings from the stars, advanced humans who survived some earlier catastrophe, or simply the mythological explanation for gradually accumulated wisdom, the result was the same. Humanity learned to survive winter. And here's a small detail that always makes me smile softly in the darkness. Among the food preservation techniques, there's mention in later Sumerian texts of something they called the strange root, likely garlic or onions, both of which grew wild in the region. These weren't just food, they were discovered to have antiseptic properties. Rubbed on wounds, they prevented the infections that killed as many people as hunger during the harsh months. Eaten regularly, they seemed to keep people healthier, though they couldn't have known why. Couldn't have understood that these pungent bulbs contained allicin and other compounds that boost immune function. They just knew that the Anunnaki had told them to eat these strange, strong-tasting roots throughout winter, and those who did seemed to fare better. Sometimes survival tastes odd, a little sharp, a bit unpleasant, but effective all the same. As that first winter with the Anunnaki wore on, the people learned about layering. Not just clothing, though they did learn to trap air between layers of linen and wool for insulation, but layering in food preparation. They discovered that a stew cooked slowly over many hours, built in layers of flavor and nutrition, could feed more people with less fuel than quickly roasted meat. The oldest cooking pot ever discovered, found in China but dating to similar periods, shows scorch marks consistent with long, slow cooking. This technique allowed them to extract every possible nutrient from bones, making them soft enough to eat, releasing the marrow's fat and the collagen that would thicken the broth into something substantial and healing. The fire crackles. The wind outside sighs against ancient walls. And slowly, through that winter, the people stopped simply surviving and began to learn the art of living through darkness, carrying light within themselves. Let your breath slow now. Let this image settle into your mind like snow falling on still water. And when you're ready, allow yourself to drift gently into the next chapter, where we'll discover what happened when spring finally, miraculously, returned. The first signs of spring in ancient Mesopotamia must have felt like witnessing resurrection itself. After months of gray skies and bitter cold, after weeks when hope felt as scarce as food, there would come a morning when the wind shifted. It no longer cut through clothing with that knife-edge sharpness. Instead, it carried something else, a hint of moisture, a subtle warmth, a whisper of possibility. And for those who'd survived that first winter under the guidance of the Anunnaki, this warmth carried extra meaning. They hadn't just endured, they'd learned. They'd transformed from people who feared winter into people who could master it. But spring, the Anunnaki taught them, wasn't a time for celebration alone. It was a time for crucial work, for taking the survival knowledge of winter and transmuting it into abundance that would carry them through the next cold season. And this meant understanding seeds. Now, I realize that seeds might not seem like the most thrilling topic as you're drifting toward sleep, but there's something deeply soothing about seed knowledge, something that connects us to the very rhythm of life itself. So let me share this slowly, gently, like planting thoughts in the soft soil of your drowsy mind. The Anunnaki, according to cylinder seals discovered at various Sumerian sites and dated to around 4000 BC, showed the people something remarkable about seeds that they'd never understood before. Seeds weren't just the beginning of plants. They were tiny vessels of compressed time and potential. A single barley seed, no bigger than the tip of your little finger, contained within itself the instruction set for creating a plant that could produce hundreds more seeds. It was multiplication, but living multiplication, organic mathematics written in a language of chlorophyll and cell division. The ancient peoples had scattered seeds before, certainly. They'd noticed that where seeds fell, plants might grow. But the Anunnaki taught them precision. They showed them how to select the largest, healthiest seeds from the previous harvest, what we now call selective breeding, though they wouldn't have called it anything at all. They simply learned to choose well. Archaeological evidence from early Neolithic sites shows a marked change in grain size over generations, proving that this selection process was happening, that humans were actively shaping the plants that fed them. There's something oddly relaxing about imagining this work, isn't there? Picture yourself sitting in weak spring sunshine, surrounded by baskets of seeds. Your task is simple. Pick up a seed, examine it, decide if it's worthy of planting or should be ground into flour instead. One by one, handful by handful, you're quite literally selecting the future. The best seeds go into one basket, wrapped in cloth for protection. The mediocre ones go to another purpose. It's meditative work, the kind that lets your mind wander while your hands stay busy. The Anunnaki taught them about spacing too. Not clumping all the seeds together in one desperate pile, hoping for the best, but carefully measuring distances using body parts as guides. a forearm's length between seed rows, a palm's width between individual seeds. This spacing, which agricultural scientists would much later explain in terms of resource competition and optimal sunlight exposure, meant that each plant had enough soil nutrients, enough water, enough room to grow strong. The resulting harvest could triple or quadruple what random scattering produced. But here's where it becomes truly interesting, in that gentle way that's perfect for drifting minds. The Anunnaki didn't just teach agricultural spacing. They taught the people about companion planting, the practice of growing certain plants together because they helped each other thrive. The famous Three Sisters of Native American agriculture, corn, beans, and squash planted together, has parallels in ancient Mesopotamian practices. They learned to plant certain legumes alongside grain because these legumes somehow made the soil better, richer, more fertile. We now know this is because legumes fix nitrogen from the air into soil-accessible forms, but they simply knew, plant these together, harvest more of both. Among the foods they cultivated, let me tell you about three that I find particularly comforting to contemplate. First, the humble lentil. These small, lens-shaped legumes, which actually gave us the word lens because of their shape, were a staple in ancient diets. They dried beautifully, lasting through entire winters without spoiling. When cooked slowly with a little fat and perhaps some of those strange roots we mentioned, onions or garlic, they became a thick, hearty porridge that warmed you from the inside. Lentils appear in archaeological sites throughout the Fertile Crescent dating back to 11,000 BCE, making them one of humanity's oldest cultivated foods. There's something profoundly settling about eating a food that your ancestors ate 10,000 years ago, don't you think? A connection through time made of simple, sustaining protein. Second, let me mention honey. Now, honey isn't a seed crop, obviously, but the Anunnaki taught the people about the connection between planted flowers and the wild bees that would visit them. They learned that certain flowers, like those of the date palm, which produced their beloved sweet fruit, needed bees for pollination. Honey was discovered in sealed jars in ancient Egyptian tombs, still edible after 3,000 years because honey never spoils. Never. It's one of the few foods that's genuinely eternal. The ancient Mesopotamians learned to rob wild beehives carefully, taking only some honey and leaving enough for the bees to survive. This sweet, golden substance became medicine for wounds, preservation agent for fruits, and of course, a rare treat that made even the simplest barley cake feel like a feast. Imagine tasting honey for the first time, that complex sweetness that's somehow floral and warm and utterly unlike anything else. Pure concentrated sunshine, turned liquid by tiny winged alchemists. Third, and this might seem odd, but I want to tell you about a food that many ancient peoples ate but which we've largely forgotten: roasted grasshoppers. Before you wrinkle your nose, consider this. Grasshoppers and locusts are incredibly protein-dense, requiring no domestication, no crop space, no cultivation time. When swarms appeared, which they regularly did in ancient Mesopotamia, they were both a threat and opportunity. The Anunnaki taught the people to see them not as pure disaster but as a harvest of a different sort. Roasted quickly in hot oil or fat, salted with that precious mineral, grasshoppers became crunchy, nutty snacks that could be dried and stored. Leviticus, written much later, specifically permits eating certain locusts, showing how widespread this practice was. There's actually a species called desert locust that's still eaten today in parts of the Middle East and Africa, rich in protein and minerals. Survival sometimes requires setting aside modern squeamishness and recognizing that our ancestors were remarkably practical about nutrition. The spring planting season was short, terrifyingly short. The window between soil too cold and wet and soil too dry and hard might be only a few weeks. The Anunnaki taught the importance of timing, of reading subtle signs in nature. When certain wildflowers bloomed, it was time to plant certain crops. When specific birds returned from their winter migrations, it meant the soil had reached the right temperature. This phenological knowledge, the study of periodic plant and animal life cycle events, is something we've largely lost, but which was absolutely crucial to survival. Plant too early, and a late frost kills everything. Plant too late, and the summer heat withers young plants before they establish deep roots. Plant exactly right, and abundance follows. There are clay tablets, discovered at the site of Nippur in Iraq and dated to around 1500 BCE, that contain what we now recognize as farmers' almanacs. These texts, written in careful cuneiform, list month by month what agricultural tasks should be performed. They're strangely soothing to read, even in translation. In the month of Nisanu, repair the irrigation channels. In the month of Ayaru, plant barley. In the month of Simanu, weed the fields. There's a rhythm to it, a sense that life is predictable, manageable, survivable if you just follow the steps, do the work, trust the cycle. The Anunnaki, the texts tell us, stayed through that first spring, watching as the people implemented what they'd learned. They watched as the first green shoots pushed through dark soil, as fields transformed from brown to emerald, as the careful spacing created orderly rows of growth instead of chaotic tangles. And they taught one more crucial lesson: gratitude. Not as a religious obligation, but as a psychological survival tool. The people were instructed to acknowledge what the earth provided, to recognize their partnership with soil and sun and water. Modern psychology would call this mindfulness or gratitude practice, but they called it offering, setting aside a portion of the first harvest, burning it so the smoke rose to the sky, marking the transition from scarcity to abundance. Imagine standing in a field at dawn, surrounded by grain that waves in the breeze like a golden ocean. You remember hunger. You remember the cold. You remember wondering if you'd see this moment. And now you're here, and the earth has once again proven generous, and your hands will harvest what your hands planted, and the cycle continues. There's something almost unbearably peaceful about that moment, isn't there? That relief, that satisfaction, that bone-deep knowledge that you've done well, that you'll eat, that winter will come again but you'll be ready. The Anunnaki began to appear less frequently as spring progressed into summer. The texts describe them becoming translucent, less solid, as if they were made of morning mist that the strengthening sun gradually dissolved. But their knowledge remained, embedded now in human practice, in the calluses on farmers' hands, in the filled storage jars, in the children who watched their parents work and learned without knowing they were learning. Let your mind rest now in that ancient field. Feel the sun warming your shoulders. Smell the green growing things and the dark earth. Hear the distant sound of others working, singing old songs to maintain rhythm, to make labor feel less like work and more like dance. Let the peacefulness of that scene carry you deeper into rest, into the place where sleep and story blend into something sweeter than either alone. And when you're ready, drift with me into the next chapter, where we'll discover what the Anunnaki taught about building shelter that could truly withstand winter's worst. As summer deepened over ancient Mesopotamia, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, the people who'd learned the Anunnaki's seed wisdom found themselves facing a different kind of lesson. The grain was growing well. The storage pits were being prepared, dug deep according to the specifications they'd been taught. But there remained a weakness, a vulnerability that no amount of food could address. Their shelters were inadequate. The simple structures that sufficed through mild winters became death traps during harsh ones. Cold seeped through walls made of mud brick dried in the sun. Wind found every gap, every crack, stealing warmth faster than fires could generate it. And so the Anunnaki turned their attention to architecture, not grand temples or imposing ziggurats, but humble dwellings designed with a single purpose: keeping humans alive when the world turned hostile. There's something wonderfully soothing about the logic of good shelter, the way it appeals to that deep human need for safety, for a boundary between self and chaos. Let me walk you through what they taught, slowly, like building a structure one careful brick at a time in your drowsy imagination. The first principle the Anunnaki emphasized was thermal mass. Now, that's a modern term, but the concept is ancient. Thermal mass means using materials that absorb heat when it's abundant and release it slowly when temperatures drop. The sun-baked mud bricks the Mesopotamians already used had some thermal mass, but the Anunnaki taught them to make those bricks thicker, denser, with specific ratios of clay to sand to straw. Archaeological analysis of bricks from around 3000 BCE shows a marked improvement in composition compared to earlier periods, with optimal binding and insulation properties emerging. But thickness alone wasn't enough. The Anunnaki showed them how to build double walls with an air gap between them. This seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why use more materials to create empty space? But that gap, that pocket of trapped air, is actually an extraordinary insulator. Air, when it can't circulate freely, conducts heat very poorly. It becomes a barrier. So while cold wind might make the outer wall frigid, that trapped air layer prevents the cold from reaching the inner wall where people actually lived. The same principle, reversed, kept the interior cooler during brutal summer heat. Some of the oldest remaining structures in Mesopotamia, like portions of Eridu dated to approximately 5000 BC, show evidence of this double wall construction. The placement of the fire pit was crucial, not in the center of the room, where people might assume. The Anunnaki taught them to build the fire pit slightly off-center, backed against one of the thick walls. Because that wall would absorb the fire's heat and radiate it back into the living space for hours after the fire died down. The wall became a thermal battery, storing warmth during the evening when fire burned bright, releasing it through the night when fuel ran low. Excavations of ancient hearths show stone or brick backing walls blackened by centuries of fires, walls built extra thick specifically to maximize this heat storage effect. Let me tell you about 3 foods that connect to this hearth-centered living, because food and shelter were never truly separate in ancient life. First, there's the flatbread that every culture in this region made, that simple combination of flour and water slapped against the hot stones surrounding the fire pit. Each family had their technique, their particular way of mixing and stretching the dough, their preferred thickness. When you cooked bread this way, directly on heated stones, it cooked in moments, puffing up with steam, creating pockets that you could fill with whatever else you had, dates and honey for a sweet version, or herbs and cheese if you were fortunate enough to have access to goat's milk products. Bread like this appears in Mesopotamian art and texts constantly, showing how central it was to daily life. There's something wonderfully meditative about making flatbread, that slap of dough against stone, the brief wait, the perfect moment when you flip it before it burns. Repetitive, simple, satisfying. Second, I want to mention preserved fish. The Tigris and Euphrates provided abundant fish, particularly carp and catfish. But fresh fish spoils quickly, disastrously quickly in hot climates. The Anunnaki taught several preservation methods, but the most relevant to our discussion of fire and shelter was smoke preservation. They learned to hang fish on racks above the fire pit, where the smoke would slowly dry and cure the flesh while adding flavor. This served double purpose, preserving valuable protein while also utilizing smoke that would otherwise just rise to the ceiling. The oldest evidence of fish preservation comes from coastal sites, but by around 4000 BCE, the practice was clearly established inland. Smoked fish, stored in sealed jars, could last months, providing crucial protein during winter when fishing was difficult or impossible. The smell of fish smoking mixed with wood smoke became the scent of security, of winter preparations proceeding properly. Third, let's talk about something that seems peculiar but is actually quite common: fermented grain porridge. Not the beer we mentioned earlier, but something between beer and bread, a thick, slightly sour porridge made by mixing coarse ground grain with water and letting wild yeasts begin fermentation before cooking it slowly at the edge of the fire pit. This fermentation partially broke down the grain, making it easier to digest and more nutritious. Cooked slowly in clay pots nestled in hot ashes, it required almost no attention, just occasional stirring. You could start it in the evening, let it cook through the night using the fire's residual heat, and wake to breakfast that had essentially made itself. References to this kind of dish appear in various ancient texts, and variations of it persist in traditional diets worldwide. Scottish porridge, African ugali, Korean juk, all descendants of this ancient technique. There's something profoundly comforting about porridge, isn't there? That warm, soft, uncomplicated sustenance. Food that asks nothing of you but acceptance. The Anunnaki also taught about the spiritual and practical importance of never letting the fire die completely. This might sound like superstition, but it had genuine survival value. Starting a fire from scratch with flint and tinder was difficult, time-consuming, and sometimes impossible in damp conditions. But keeping a fire alive, banking it properly with ash to slow combustion, preserving coals that could be coaxed back to flame when needed, this was achievable. Clay tablets recording temple procedures, like those from the UR3 period around 2100 BC, specifically describe the keeper of the sacred fire, whose sole responsibility was ensuring the temple's fire never died. This wasn't just religious practice. It was acknowledgement of fire's absolute centrality to survival. In homes, this same principle applied. Before sleep, you'd carefully arrange the fuel, cover much of the fire with ash to slow oxygen flow, position specific logs in particular ways that would allow them to smolder through the night without blazing. Done correctly, you'd wake to coals still warm enough to restart the fire quickly with a bit of kindling and gentle breath. There's an art to this, a knowledge that took practice to master. The difference between waking to warmth and waking to cold could depend entirely on how well you banked the fire before sleep. The Anunnaki taught specific designs for winter shelters that differed from summer ones. Winter structures were smaller. Less interior volume meant less space to heat. They had fewer, smaller openings. Windows were small or covered with animal skins to prevent heat loss while still allowing some light. The entrance was often a labyrinth design, a short corridor that turned at right angles before entering the main living space, preventing wind from blowing directly into the home. These design elements, which we can identify in archaeological remains, show sophisticated understanding of heat retention and airflow. But architecture wasn't just about physical structure. The Anunnaki taught the people to think about layout, about how families should position themselves within the shelter to maximize warmth. Sleeping platforms were built above floor level because warm air rises and cold air sinks. The coldest air would pool at floor level, so sleeping even a foot higher made a noticeable difference. Families slept close together, combining body heat, what we might now call social thermoregulation. Children slept between adults, protected on both sides. The elderly and sick were given spots closest to the banked fire. These weren't written rules but transmitted wisdom, survival knowledge encoded in social practice. There's a tablet fragment, now in the British Museum, catalogued simply as BM 74329, that contains what appears to be building instructions. It's damaged, incomplete, but the legible portions describe wall thickness, recommend building materials, and specify the sacred orientation of the entrance. Some scholars believe these might be instructions that originated with the Anunnaki teachings, later codified by human scribes. Whether that's true or not, the instructions work. Buildings made to these specifications, even modern reconstructions, demonstrate impressive thermal efficiency using nothing but ancient materials and methods. As summer faded toward autumn, the people applied these architectural lessons, repairing their homes, reinforcing walls, and preparing for the coming cold. The Anunnaki moved among them less frequently now, their teaching largely complete. The texts describe them watching from distances, observing how well the humans had internalized the lessons, whether they would remember and apply the knowledge when winter arrived and the teachers had returned to the stars. Imagine that feeling, being entrusted with knowledge that will determine whether your family survives, whether your children see another spring. The weight of that responsibility, but also the empowerment of it. You're not helpless anymore. You understand thermal mass and air gaps and fire banking. You can build a shelter that holds warmth like cupped hands hold water. You've become competent, capable, resistant to winter's worst assaults. Let yourself feel that security now. Imagine walls around you that breathe but don't draft, that warm slowly in sun and hold that warmth through night. Imagine a fire banked perfectly, glowing softly through ash, promising to wake to warmth. Feel your body relaxing into that safety, that carefully constructed cocoon of survival. And when sleep pulls at you, when your thoughts become soft and scattered like snow, drift with me into the next chapter, where we'll explore the mysteries of water in winter, how the Anunnaki taught the management of humanity's most crucial resource when rivers froze and wells ran dry. Water. Such a simple thing, so easy to take for granted. Turn a tap, fill a glass, drink without thought. But in ancient Mesopotamia, water was never simple. It was everything. It was life measured in liquid form, flowing through irrigation channels, pooling in cisterns, determining which fields flourished and which families starved. And in winter, water became complicated. It became dangerous. It became, paradoxically, both scarce and threatening at once. Rivers ran cold and silty. Wells could freeze at their surfaces. Rain became unreliable. And contaminated water could kill as efficiently as any weapon. The Anunnaki understood water in ways that seemed almost mystical to the ancient peoples, though we might now recognize their knowledge as hydrology and microbiology expressed through practical technique. Let me share their water wisdom with you slowly, gently, like water itself finding its level, settling into the lowest, most restful places. The first teaching about winter water was about location and storage. The Anunnaki showed the people how to build cisterns, not just simple holes in the ground, but carefully engineered structures. These cisterns were dug deep below the frost line and lined with a specific mixture of clay and lime that hardened into a waterproof barrier. The shape mattered too, wider at the bottom than the top, with a narrow opening that could be covered, minimizing evaporation and preventing contamination from falling debris, dust, or the droppings of animals and birds. Archaeological excavations at sites like Habuba Kabira in Syria, dated to around 3500 BCE, reveal sophisticated cistern systems that show clear signs of this engineered design. The cisterns were positioned to capture rainwater runoff from roofs and paved areas, channeling it through filtration systems made of graded gravel and sand that removed much of the sediment and debris. This wasn't accidental. This was applied knowledge, transmitted and refined across generations. But storing water was only part of the challenge. The Anunnaki taught the crucial importance of water assessment, determining whether water was safe to drink. Without microscopes or modern testing, how could ancient peoples know if water harbored invisible dangers? The Anunnaki taught observation methods. Look for certain aquatic plants that only grew in clean water. Notice whether particular animals would drink from a source. Watch how water poured. Turbulent, living water from flowing sources was generally safer than still, stagnant water that reflected sky like dark mirrors. They also taught purification methods. The simplest was solar disinfection, filling transparent or translucent vessels with water and leaving them in direct sunlight for a full day. Sunlight, particularly its ultraviolet component, kills many waterborne pathogens. This technique has been validated by modern science. The WHO even recommends it as an emergency purification method in developing regions. But the Anunnaki taught it thousands of years before anyone understood why it worked. They just knew sun-touched water was safer than shadow water. Another purification method involved adding specific substances. Certain plant materials, the bark of particular trees, specific leaves, even garlic crushed and added to water, had antimicrobial properties. Modern analysis confirms this. Oak bark contains tannins with antibacterial effects. Various leaves produce compounds that inhibit pathogen growth. The ancient peoples didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the result. Water treated this way was less likely to cause the violent stomach troubles that could dehydrate and kill a person in days. Let me share 3 drinks that the ancient Mesopotamians developed, taught by the Anunnaki, that made winter hydration safer and more pleasant. First, there was date syrup water, a mixture of water with dissolved date syrup. Dates were boiled down into thick, sweet syrup that could be stored indefinitely. A spoonful dissolved in water provided not just sweetness but also sugar calories and some of the date's natural antimicrobial properties. The sugar content, when concentrated enough, actually prevents bacterial growth, the same principle by which honey never spoils. Archaeological evidence shows date syrup production was widespread by 3000 BCE, with specialized vessels for boiling and reducing the fruit. Second, let me mention barley water, not beer, but a lighter preparation. Barley was roasted, then steeped in water, creating a cloudy, slightly nutty drink that was both hydrating and nutritious. The roasting process killed any molds or bacteria on the grain. When steeped, the barley released starches and vitamins into the water, making it more nutritious than plain water. This was particularly valuable for the sick or elderly who couldn't eat solid food. Barley water appears in medical texts from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia as a restorative drink, gentle on troubled stomachs while still providing sustenance. There's something remarkably soothing about barley water, even now. It has a mild, comfortable flavor, neither too sweet nor too bitter, just calm. Like liquid tranquility. Third, and this one's particularly interesting, there was herbal infusion with wild mint. Various species of mint grew wild throughout Mesopotamia. The Anunnaki taught that mint leaves, dried and crumbled, could be added to hot water to create a drink that settled stomachs, cleared congestion, and masked the off flavors of water that had been stored too long. Mint contains menthol and other volatile oils with mild antiseptic properties. A warm cup of mint infusion on a cold winter evening would have been both medicine and comfort, warmth spreading from your hands through the cup, steam carrying that clean, sharp scent that opens your sinuses and clears your mind. Mint has been found in archaeological contexts throughout the ancient Near East, often in association with cooking areas and food storage, suggesting regular culinary use. The Anunnaki also taught about ice and snow, which seems obvious. Frozen water is still water, but there were crucial safety lessons. Fresh snow was generally safe to melt and drink, but snow that had been on the ground for days could be contaminated by animal tracks and waste. Ice from the surface of rivers might look pure but could contain sediment and pathogens frozen within it. The safest approach was collecting freshly fallen snow in clean vessels, melting it slowly over fire, and then treating it with the purification methods already described. There's a haunting image in one of the Sumerian texts, the Lament for Sumer and Uar, written around 2000 BC, describing winter hardship. One line, in translation, reads something like, "The water in the wells became solid, the canals brought forth no water." This crystallizes the winter water crisis, the paradox of being surrounded by frozen water yet dying of thirst. Anunnaki's teachings addressed exactly this: how to break ice safely, how to melt it efficiently, how to store meltwater so it didn't freeze, and how to keep a small supply of water from freezing even when temperatures plummeted. One technique was simple but effective: keeping a sealed vessel of water near the banked fire at night. The fire's residual heat, even when reduced to coals, was enough to prevent freezing. This water became precious, the household's emergency supply, never to be used for cooking or washing, reserved strictly for drinking if other sources failed. Families would measure this supply daily, ensuring the amount remained constant, guarding against anyone using it casually. The Anunnaki taught the people to read weather signs that predicted coming moisture. Certain cloud formations meant rain or snow within hours. Particular wind directions brought storms. Animals behaved differently before precipitation. Birds flew lower, insects disappeared, livestock became restless. By reading these signs, people could prepare, positioning collection vessels, clearing channels, readying their filtration systems. This observational meteorology was survival science, passed down through generations, encoded in proverbs and folk wisdom that modern people dismiss but which carried genuine predictive power. There's something deeply peaceful about water wisdom, don't you think? Water seeks its level, finds its course, can be guided but never truly controlled. Learning to work with water, to respect its properties and patterns, requires patience and humility. These are qualities conducive to rest, to that release of the need to dominate and control that often keeps us anxious and awake. Imagine yourself now as one of those ancient people, competent in water knowledge. You know where your cisterns are, how deep, how full. You know your purification methods. You've watched the sky and read tomorrow's weather in the evening light. You've set your collection vessels in optimal positions. You've secured your emergency water supply near the banked fire. Everything that can be done has been done. You can rest now, trusting your preparation, trusting the wisdom you've internalized. The Anunnaki grew fainter as autumn deepened, their forms becoming translucent, their voices softer, as if they were gradually returning to whatever realm had sent them forth. But their water wisdom remained, flowing through human culture like the rivers they'd taught people to manage, essential and eternal. Let your thoughts become as fluid as water now. Let tension dissolve and drain away. Let your breathing find the rhythm of waves lapping at shores, of rain pattering on roofs, of streams murmuring over stones. Water sounds, water images, water peace. And when you're ready, let's drift together into the next chapter, where we'll discover what the Anunnaki taught about community survival, about the social structures that transform individual resilience into collective security. As winter's edge drew nearer and the harvest had been gathered, as shelters had been reinforced and water secured, the Anunnaki turned their teaching toward perhaps the most crucial survival element of all, community. Because all the stored grain in the world, all the carefully banked fires and cisterns of purified water, meant nothing if humans couldn't cooperate. If they hoarded and stole, if they competed unto death, if they saw their neighbor's survival as their own threat, then winter would kill them not through cold or hunger but through the violence of isolation. The ancient Mesopotamians were not naturally communal in the way we might romanticize. They were human, territorial, suspicious, prone to favoring blood family over strangers. Archaeological evidence of fortified settlements and weapon burials tells us they knew conflict well. But the Anunnaki taught them something revolutionary, that survival mathematics changed in winter, that the resources needed to keep one family alive through harsh months could keep 3 families alive if shared intelligently. Those skills distributed across a community created resilience no individual could match. Let me walk you through these social technologies slowly, gently, like we're sitting together by a firelight and I'm sharing old, important stories that deserve careful attention even as your mind softens toward sleep. The first principle the Anunnaki taught was resource pooling. Not communism in any ideological sense, but practical sharing based on differential need and abundance. One family might have surplus grain but insufficient firewood. Another might have abundant fuel but limited food. Rather than each struggling with scarcity in one area while waste occurred in another, the Anunnaki showed them exchange systems. Not even barter exactly, but something more fluid, a recognized obligation of reciprocity. You give when you have excess, you receive when you face shortage. The community remembers. The balance evens out over time. Clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, particularly from the UR3 period around 2100 BCE, show remarkably detailed accounting of these exchanges. Temple administrators, who were essentially community record keepers, tracked who contributed what to common stores and who withdrew what in times of need. This wasn't charity, it was collective insurance. Everyone paid in during abundance. Everyone could withdraw during hardship. The system worked because memory was institutionalized, recorded, honored. Anunnaki taught the importance of skill diversification. A community where everyone had identical skills was fragile. But a community where knowledge was distributed, where some excelled at fire starting, others at food preservation, others at shelter repair, others at water management, others at child care or elder care or wound treatment. Such a community was resilient. If one person fell ill, others could step into essential roles. Skills could be taught and transmitted. Specialization allowed depth of expertise that improved everyone's chances. There's evidence in Mesopotamian texts of recognized titles that suggest exactly this kind of specialization. The fisher, the shepherd, the reed worker, the potter, the smith, these weren't just occupations but social roles, positions of responsibility and expertise. Cuneiform tablets list rations provided to people in these roles, suggesting the community fed specialists so they could focus on mastering and applying their particular knowledge for everyone's benefit. Let me share 3 specific foods that became part of this community survival system. First, there's communal stew, large pot cooking that made practical and social sense. In winter, when fuel was precious, it was more efficient to maintain one large fire for cooking than many small ones. Families would contribute what they could to a shared pot, some barley, some lentils, some dried onions, a bit of hoarded fat, whatever meat or fish was available. The resulting stew was divided proportionally, but everyone benefited from the diversity of ingredients and the fuel efficiency. Communal cooking appears in virtually every ancient culture, but in Mesopotamia, clay tablets sometimes reference the portion from the common pot given to workers or the needy. There's something deeply comforting about stew, isn't there? That long-cooked melding of flavors, the way everything softens and blends into something greater than the sum of ingredients. Stew is democratic food, humble food, survivor's food. Second, let me mention dried fruit cakes, particularly those made with dates and figs pressed together with a bit of honey or date syrup. These dense, sweet cakes were energy-packed and portable. They appear in ration lists for travelers and workers. But they were also community food, made during autumn's abundance when everyone worked together processing the harvest. The elderly would pit dates, too old for hard labor but perfectly capable of repetitive hand work. Children would gather figs. Stronger adults would press and shape the cakes. Making these was a social event, an opportunity for storytelling and knowledge transmission, for the old teaching the young while hands stayed busy. The resulting cakes were distributed and stored, each family receiving some, but extra going into community reserves for emergencies. Archaeological sites have yielded these cakes, preserved by their sugar content and dryness, some over 4,000 years old and still recognizable. Third, there's salted meat, another community product. When animals were slaughtered, usually in autumn before winter feeding became too costly, no single family could consume the meat before spoiling. But salt preservation required significant salt, which was expensive. The solution was communal, pooling salt resources, processing meat together, distributing the preserved result. Salt was so valuable in ancient Mesopotamia that it was used as currency in some transactions. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, salt money given to soldiers. But that practice has roots in earlier Mesopotamian systems where salt was carefully measured and accounted for. Salted meat, properly prepared, could last through entire winters. It was tough, incredibly salty, requiring soaking before eating, but it was protein when protein could mean the difference between weakness and strength, between illness and health. The Anunnaki taught conflict resolution methods appropriate for close winter quarters. When people are crowded together, confined by cold and darkness, tensions rise. Arguments over trivial matters can escalate into feuds that shatter community cohesion. So they learned structured protocols, designated mediators, usually respected elders, who would hear disputes and propose solutions. The goal wasn't punishment but restoration of harmony. Tablet archives contain records of these dispute resolutions, who was found responsible for a grievance, what compensation was owed, how the matter was settled. The very existence of these records suggests how seriously social peace was taken. They learned about shared labor for tasks too large for individuals. When heavy snow damaged roofs, the community would move from structure to structure, all working together to repair each in turn. When ice had to be broken from a frozen well, everyone who would draw from that well participated in the labor. This wasn't altruism, it was enlightened self-interest. Your turn would come. Your needs would be met because you met others' needs. The Sumerian term ijidu, which appears in various contexts, essentially means mutual aid or reciprocal assistance, suggesting this was a formalized concept. Anunnaki taught storytelling as survival technology. During long, dark winter evenings, when work was impossible and fuel had to be conserved, people gathered together for warmth and to pass time without expending calories unnecessarily. This is when stories were told. Myths, histories, instructional tales, entertainment. But stories served crucial functions. They transmitted knowledge and values, reinforced community identity, provided mental occupation that prevented the depression that could kill motivation to survive. Oral traditions preserved survival knowledge in memorable narrative form. The Epic of Gilgamesh, eventually written down but clearly oral long before, contains embedded knowledge about flood cycles, about cedar forest management, about proper kingship and friendship. These weren't just entertaining stories, they were culture's memories, passed from generation to generation. There are clay tablets called Proverbs collections, some dating to around 2500 BCE, containing short, pithy sayings that encapsulate survival wisdom. The man who travels alone brings back starvation. Fire and water are good servants but bad masters. A boat cannot travel upstream without its crew. These were teaching tools, easily memorized, frequently repeated, constantly reinforcing social cooperation. The Anunnaki, in their final teachings on community, emphasized the care of the vulnerable, children, elderly, sick, disabled. Not from sentiment alone, but from practical recognition that everyone eventually occupies each category. Children represent future survival. They must be protected and educated. The elderly hold experience and knowledge. They must be kept alive to share it. The sick and injured may recover to contribute again. Abandoning them wastes their potential return to productivity. And the disabled often develop compensatory skills that prove valuable. The blind person who becomes the community's best auditory processor of information, the lame person who becomes the finest craftsperson because they spend more time working with their hands. Imagine the feeling of living in such a community. You know your role, your contribution, your value. You know others will help if you falter. You know the grain you contributed during abundance will return as bread during scarcity. You know that the roof you helped repair on your neighbor's shelter means neighbors will repair yours when needed. There's security in this, a relaxation of the constant vigilance that exhausts you when you're alone against the world. The Anunnaki grew so faint now, so translucent, that they were visible only at dawn and dusk, and then only to those who looked carefully with softened eyes. They had taught what they came to teach. The survival of these people no longer depended on divine intervention but on human wisdom, human cooperation, and human resilience. Winter is coming. It would be hard, but they would endure. Let that security settle over you now like a warm blanket. You are not alone. You never were. Humans survive together through cooperation and care and shared knowledge. feel yourself held in that ancient network of mutual support, that web of obligation and aid that made civilization possible. Let your breathing slow. Let community trust replace individual anxiety. And when sleep reaches for you with gentle hands, drift with me one more time into the final chapter, where we'll discover what happened when spring returned and the Anunnaki departed forever, leaving humanity to stand alone. The winter that followed Anunnaki's teachings was harsh, as winter must be to test lessons learned. The wind howled down from distant mountains, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Rivers froze at their edges, something that hadn't happened in living memory. Snow fell not once but repeatedly, blanketing the land in white silence. And the people, those who had listened, who had learned, who had implemented the teachings, they survived. Not easily, not without loss, but they survived in numbers unprecedented for such a hard season. They survived because their storage pits were deep and full, because their shelters held heat, because their water remained accessible and pure, because their community held together, sharing and supporting through the longest nights. And somewhere in those dark months, the Anunnaki disappeared entirely. No more translucent figures glimpsed at dawn. No more whispered advice on the wind. Just absence. Just the knowledge they'd left behind, embedded now in human culture, and the question of whether people could maintain and transmit that knowledge without divine teachers to reinforce it. Let me guide you gently through this final chapter, this story of legacy and independence, as we bring our long night's tale to its peaceful close. The first test of human retention came in spring, when planting season arrived. Would they remember the seed selection protocols? Would they maintain the careful spacing, the companion planting, the phenological timing? The tablets don't tell us much about individual anxieties, but we can imagine the worry. What if we've forgotten something crucial? What if we misunderstood? The Anunnaki had made it look effortless, but effortless mastery takes practice, and they'd had only 1 year of instruction. But the elderly remembered. Those who'd paid closest attention, who'd asked questions, who'd practiced the techniques under supervision, they stepped forward as teachers themselves. Knowledge began its human transmission, passing from those who'd learned from gods to those who learned from grandparents. The process was imperfect. Details were lost, garbled, misremembered. But the core survived. The planted seeds grew. The harvest came. Not as abundant as the previous year, but sufficient. Survival continued. Over generations, knowledge evolved. Humans added their own observations, their innovations and improvements. They forgot the Anunnaki's names but remembered their techniques. The stories became myths, the myths became traditions, the traditions became the way things are done, with origin stories fading into irrelevance because the practices simply worked. Let me share one last trio of foods that emerged from this post-Anunnaki period, foods that combine the teachings with human creativity. First, there's a dish we might call ancestor stew, though that's not what they called it. This stew was made to a specific formula that families would prepare on winter solstice. The longest night, the darkest point, the moment when survival was most uncertain. Each family had slight variations, but the core was consistent: barley, lentils, dried dates, salted fish or meat, all the preserved elements of survival slowly cooked together. It was ritual food, yes, but also supremely practical, a nutritional bomb of calories, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates that fortified people against midwinter's worst. Eating it became both practical sustenance and spiritual reassurance. We are still here, still following the ways that keep us alive, still connected to the wisdom that sustains us. The oldest recipes recorded on tablets, like those from the Yale Babylonian collection dating to around 1700 BCE, show dishes that clearly descend from these survival stews, elaborated and refined but fundamentally unchanged. Second, let me mention New Year bread, special loaves made when spring arrived and winter ended. These used the first grain from storage that had been kept through the entire winter, proving the success of preservation techniques. The bread was shaped elaborately, sometimes in forms representing animals or celestial bodies, and was shared communally. But before the elaborate ritual meaning, it was simply celebration. We made it, we survived, we have food to share even after winter's extraction. Bread like this appears in Mesopotamian festival texts, always associated with survival celebrations, with marking the successful passage through dangerous seasons. There's archaeological evidence of special bread molds dating to around 2500 BC, suggesting this practice was old even then, likely extending back to the earliest post-Anunnaki generations. Third, there's what we might call journey food, a mixture of rendered fat, dried fruit, ground nuts or seeds, and sometimes honey, formed into dense cakes or balls. This appears first in ration lists for messengers and traders who traveled between settlements. It was concentrated survival food, each bite packed with calories and nutrients, capable of lasting indefinitely without spoiling. The recipe bears clear hallmarks of Anunnaki teaching: fat for calories and satiation, fruit for quick energy and preservation, seeds for protein, honey for additional preservation and energy. Modern analysis of residue from ancient containers reveals exactly these components mixed together. These journey foods were humanity taking survival knowledge and adapting it for new purposes, not just surviving winter in place, but surviving movement through hostile spaces, extending the principles of preservation and efficiency to mobile contexts. We still make foods like this: pemmican, energy bars, trail mix, all descendants of that ancient innovation. As years became decades, and centuries became centuries, the Anunnaki receded into pure mythology. Various city-states told different versions of the story. Some said the Anunnaki still watched from the stars. Others claimed they'd never left, that they walked among humans in disguise. Still others said they'd been human all along, just extraordinarily wise individuals mythologized over time. The truth of their nature became less important than the truth of their legacy. Humanity had learned to survive winter, and in surviving had laid foundations for civilization itself. Because that's what those survival techniques enabled: permanent settlement. When you can reliably store food, you don't have to migrate with the seasons. When you can preserve water and maintain warmth, you can focus on activities beyond immediate survival. You can specialize. You can develop art, mathematics, writing, and law. You can build cities. The ziggurats that rose across Mesopotamia, those massive step temples reaching toward the sky, they were possible only because agricultural surplus freed labor for construction. And that surplus came from the techniques that kept food from spoiling, kept communities cooperating, kept knowledge transmitting across generations. There's a moving passage in the Instructions of Shurupak, one of the oldest surviving pieces of wisdom literature, dated to around 2600 BC. A father advises his son on proper living. Most of it is practical ethics, but one line in various translations says something like, "Store provisions for winter. Winter does not announce its arrival." This simple advice encapsulates the entire Anunnaki legacy. Prepare, plan, remember that harsh seasons return, maintain the knowledge that allows survival. It's so matter-of-fact, so assumed, suggesting that by this point winter survival was simply expected competence, no longer remarkable achievement. The legacy extended beyond Mesopotamia. Trade networks carried preservation techniques, architectural knowledge, and water management strategies to surrounding regions. Egypt learned from Mesopotamia, learned from the Indus Valley, learned from China, each culture adapting survival knowledge to local conditions but all building on fundamental principles. Store food, manage water, build appropriate shelter, maintain community, transmit knowledge. The Anunnaki's teachings, if they were ever discrete teachings rather than gradual accumulation, dispersed and dissolved into human culture globally. In our modern world, we've largely forgotten these things. We've externalized survival to systems and infrastructure we don't understand. We turn thermostats without knowing how heat is generated. We open refrigerators without considering the chain of preservation, transportation, and agriculture that fills them. We've become disconnected from the fundamental knowledge that kept our ancestors alive. Perhaps there's peace in that ignorance, in trusting systems to handle our survival. But perhaps there's also vulnerability. What happens when systems fail? But that's not a question for tonight. Tonight is for sleep, for dreams, for letting ancient stories carry you into rest. You've drifted through thousands of years, through winter survival and spring return, through divine teaching and human learning. You've imagined cold and warmth, hunger and abundance, isolation and community. You've traveled through time in the company of people long dead but whose knowledge lives on in you, in the very fact that you exist because every single one of your ancestors survived long enough to reproduce, passing forward their genes and their wisdom. Feel that now. Feel the unbroken chain of survival that leads to this moment, to you breathing slowly in safety, wrapped in warmth, with food in your home and water at hand. Feel gratitude not as obligation but as simple recognition. You are the latest link in a chain of endurance that stretches back to the first humans who learned to survive winter, whether they learned from Anunnaki or from trial and error and blood and loss. The story ends, but only for tonight. History continues. You continue. And tomorrow, when you wake, you'll carry forward some small piece of what we've shared here. maybe just a curiosity about ancient grain storage, maybe a deeper appreciation for the knowledge embedded in ordinary practices, maybe nothing conscious at all except having slept well after a long, gentle story. Thank you for traveling through this piece of history with me. Thank you for letting my voice keep you company through the night. If you drifted peacefully into sleep somewhere along the way, I'm glad. That's exactly what this was for. If you're still here, still listening, I hope you feel the gentle pull of rest now, that softening at the edges of consciousness that means sleep is near. If you'd like to return another night, if this calm journey helped you unwind, you know where to find me. Let me know in the comments below which part of the story stayed with you, or simply that you were here, that you listened, that you drifted. I'd love to know where you are in the world, what time you're listening, whether it's darkness or dawn or the strange liminal space between. But for now, for tonight, simply rest. Let your body sink deeper into your bed. Let your breathing slow to its most peaceful rhythm. Let your mind release its grip on waking thoughts. And let sleep, that most ancient gift, wrap you in its gentle embrace. Sweet dreams, dear friends. Sweet, peaceful dreams. Until we meet again in the quiet spaces where stories and sleep intertwine, good night.